He was standing in the steam, towel low on his hips, eyes calm, steady. I hadn't meant to walk in on him. I'd opened the bathroom door without thinking. Half asleep, barefoot, wearing one of my old cotton nightshirts. I'd expected it to be empty. But instead, I saw him, my husband's son, like that. And what froze me wasn't his body, although it was unmistakably a man's now, sculpted and effortless. It was the way he didn't flinch, didn't grab the towel or look away. He just looked. And God, help me. I looked back. That moment cracked something. I closed the door as if it were just a mistake, just a second too early, but it wasn't. It was something I would carry with me for hours. Like a trace of warmth left on skin after a hand is gone. He had arrived 2 days earlier. My husband invited him to stay with us over the summer, said it might help him recover from a bad breakup. I'd only seen him twice in the past 5 years. Once, at a wedding, once at his graduation. The boy who used to sulk behind a phone screen had turned into someone quieter, but grounded, confident without being loud. He shook my hand when he came in, not hugged. It was strangely intimate in its restraint. My husband, ever pragmatic, was thrilled. He had someone to talk about stocks and the market with. They spent evenings side by side at the kitchen table with their laptops, occasionally murmuring something to each other. The house took on a different rhythm, slower, thicker, like the air before rain. But it was me who noticed the little things. He rinsed his coffee cup and placed it upside down like I always do. He didn't scroll during meals. He asked about my work. Real questions, not polite ones. I caught him once watching me as I reached for something on a high shelf. The look wasn't crude, but it wasn't nothing, and maybe that was what scared me. It wasn't nothing. At first, I tried to laugh at myself. I was imagining things, filling silence with fiction. It had been too long since anyone looked at me like that. If he had, I told myself I was just being vain, absurd. But my body disagreed. I felt it every morning, the way I suddenly paid attention to what I wore when I passed him in the hallway. Not dramatic, just a soft blouse, a hint of lace underneath. Not for him, I insisted silently. For me. And yet. That morning, after I saw him in the bathroom, I changed out of my nightshirt more deliberately. I stood in front of the mirror longer. I picked underwear that I hadn't worn in months. Soft cream, low cut, edged with lace. No reason, no one would see it. But I needed to feel it against my skin. Needed to remember something still worked inside me. When I came downstairs, he was already in the kitchen. He wore a simple gray t-shirt, damp hair curling slightly at the back of his neck. He had made a full pot of coffee and set out 2 mugs. When I walked in, he looked up and nodded, sliding. One toward me. I don't remember what we said, probably nothing beyond morning. But the silence between us had changed texture. It wasn't the absence of conversation. It was the pressure of everything unspoken. Later that day, as I folded laundry in the living room, I found myself rewinding that bathroom moment. Replaying it, slowing it down, wondering if he noticed my pause, wondering if he had wanted me to. My husband was in his office on a conference call. He'd been in there for hours. I could hear his voice through the wall. Steady, controlled, professional. I knew his schedule, his patterns, his coffee order, his size, but not his thoughts, not anymore. It wasn't that we were unhappy. People think affairs begin with shouting matches and slammed doors. Sometimes they begin with too much silence. My husband and I didn't fight. We had routines, traditions. We still slept in the same bed, but his hand hadn't reached for me in weeks. When he kissed me, it was soft, routine, like brushing teeth, or tying shoes. It meant nothing. And maybe that was what hurt the most. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to footsteps upstairs, faint creaks of the floorboards. His room was right above ours. I imagined him tossing, turning, just like me. I imagined him remembering the way I'd looked at him, half-dressed, surprised but unafraid. I imagined him wondering, but I didn't need to imagine myself. I knew exactly what I was doing, folding temptation into ordinary days, slipping danger into domestic life like a needle between couch cushions. And I knew, just as clearly as I knew my own name, that this was only the beginning. The day he and I were left alone in the house didn't feel significant at first. My husband had left for an overnight business trip, one of those quick in and outs that required little more than a garment bag and a printed itinerary. He kissed me in the doorway, told me to sleep well, and disappeared into his Uber like he always did. Efficiently, quietly, predictably. I stood by the window, holding the curtain open slightly with 2 fingers, watching his car disappear down the street. When the taillights were gone, I didn't move for a full minute. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe confirmation, that I was still myself, maybe the sound of guilt. But it didn't come. Instead, I went upstairs and opened my closet. There was no need to change. I'd already been dressed for the day. Simple jeans, a white tee, barefoot. But I stood there. Anyway, looking through hangers. Fingertips trailing over fabrics like I was blind and trying to read, I pulled out a fitted sweater I rarely wore anymore. Thin, soft, a bit too short, the kind of thing that makes you straighten your posture. Underneath, I chose a dark red. Bra with matching lace at the edge. I wore it under a denim shirt and left the top 2 buttons undone. Not enough to say something, but enough to make someone wonder if it was intentional. He was in the kitchen again. Of course, that had become his territory in a way that amused me. He brewed coffee, washed dishes, organized drawers that had lived in chaos for years. I think I'd begun looking for excuses to enter the room whenever he was there, just to feel that shift in air pressure when we were within 5 feet of each other. He was chopping something. This time, carrots, I think. He turned when I came in, lifted the knife slightly in greeting. I raised an eyebrow at the cutting board. You planning to feed an army? Making soup. Thought you might want some later. Soup? I smiled, leaning slightly against the counter. That's ambitious. He shrugged, and I noticed his sleeves were pushed up, forearms exposed. There was something calming about watching him work, hands steady, movements measured, like he knew what he was doing, like he'd done it before. I walked to the sink and rinsed a mug, deliberately brushing past him. There was space to avoid contact. I didn't. I let my hip graze his side lightly, as if by mistake. He didn't move. I didn't know you cooked, I said quietly, placing the mug upside down to dry. Most women don't wait long enough to find out. His voice was even, but there was weight under the words. I turned my head, but he didn't look at me. He was still slicing, focused, deliberate. I sat at the table and watched him, fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic of a fresh cup of tea. The window was cracked slightly open, letting in a breeze that lifted the curtain and stirred the scent of herbs. Garlic and something else, something unnamed. The distance between us wasn't more than a few feet, but the weight of it was dizzying. Every gesture had a second layer. Every glance carried the possibility of misinterpretation. Or perfect. Understanding. It happened later, in the hallway. I was heading to the laundry room with an armful of clean towels. The basket was awkward, and I had to shift it to open the door. I didn't hear him coming until he turned the corner sharply, nearly, colliding with me. He was fresh out of the shower again, towel low on his hips, bare chest still damp. This time, though, there was no steam to blur the edges. Everything was stark and visible and quiet. We froze. My hands tightened on the basket, but I didn't back away. His eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, then lifted again. This wasn't like the first time. There was no shock, just awareness. Me, in my soft sweater, him, half naked, and everything in between, raw and suspended. I didn't mean to. He started. You're fine, I said. Too quickly, too flatly. My voice didn't match my heartbeat. The silence after that was electric. He stepped forward. I didn't move. You're shaking, he said. I was. Not visibly, but he could feel it. Our proximity made that inevitable. I'm not. I lied, my throat dry. You are. He reached out. His fingers didn't touch skin. They just brushed the edge of my elbow through the fabric. But it was enough. That tiny contact felt like heat. My knees nearly buckled. I looked up, and our eyes locked again, like in the bathroom. Only this time, I didn't leave. He leaned forward slowly, hesitantly. I could have stopped him. I should have. I didn't. His lips touched mine, Soft, uncertain, a question more than a demand. I answered. The kiss was short, tentative. There was no pressure, no hunger, just a confirmation that we'd both felt the same thing, that it wasn't just me. When we parted, his forehead lingered near mine. I kept my eyes closed for a moment, just breathing, just holding the fragile quiet between us like a secret. I shouldn't have, he whispered. I opened my eyes. He was close enough to see the line of a scar near his jaw. I'd never noticed before, neither should I said, and then I stepped back. Not far, just enough to breathe. I walked past him without another word, the towel still clutched to my chest, heart pounding like I'd run miles. Later, folding those same towels, I caught myself smiling, not because it had happened, but because I hadn't imagined it. Something real had slipped through the cracks today, something I couldn't take back. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the shame, the fear, the flicker of thrill, was something even more dangerous. Hope. The house was full again by the end of the week. My husband decided, with little warning, to host a casual dinner for the family. His mother, his sister, their teenage son, nothing extravagant, just some wine and food, a bit of catching up, he'd said, kissing me on the temple like he always did when asking for something. I agreed. Of course, I always did. That was the role I'd played well for years. Agreeable, pleasant, accommodating, the kind of woman who smiled through her own invisibility. I planned the evening down to the minute, as I always did. The tablecloth was ironed, the salad was dressed just before they arrived, the glasses were spotless. My hands moved on autopilot while my mind spiraled in quiet loops. He had kissed me. I had kissed him back. We had gone back to pretending, but something in me had not returned to stillness. He came down last, freshly shaved, in a navy shirt that brought out the darkness in his eyes. Our eyes met across the hallway. He nodded, civil, almost neutral, but not quite. The evening began with laughter, polite conversation. My husband opened a bottle of red and poured for everyone but me. He knew I preferred white and had chilled a bottle in advance. These are the things that would look like love to an outsider: attentiveness, familiarity. But they were habits, not emotions. Mechanical kindness performed for an audience. His mother, always sharp-tongued in subtle ways, asked me why I'd lost. So much weight. Too busy taking care of everyone else, I suppose, I said lightly, shrugging it off. You should eat more, she replied with a wrinkled frown, stabbing her fork into a piece of roast. You're starting to look drawn. Before I could respond, he spoke up calmly, but with an edge I'd never heard before. She looks great. Some people don't need to stuff themselves to be attractive. The table went quiet. The words weren't lewd, but the intent behind them wasn't invisible. My husband chuckled awkwardly, brushing it off. His nephew kept chewing. His sister changed the subject. But I sat frozen for a beat too long, the heat rising behind my ears, down my neck, under my dress. I looked at him. He wasn't smiling. He didn't seem amused or proud, just steady, intentional. It was the first time I'd seen him stand up for me. It rattled something I didn't know was still loose. After dinner, I took to the kitchen while they settled into the living room. From the sink, I could hear overlapping voices, talk of taxes, school, the weather, familiar sounds that usually soothed me. But now, they only made the house feel more distant. He came in while I was drying glasses, leaned against the counter with a bottle of water in one hand. He didn't speak, just watched. You shouldn't have said that, I murmured without turning. She had it coming. That's not the point. No, he said. It's not, but I said it for me, not for her. I turned then, drying towel still in my hands. The tension was back, thick as fog. You're playing with fire. He looked at me a long moment. Am I? He left me standing there, heart pounding again for reasons that had nothing to do with confrontation. I told myself I was angry, that he was reckless. But beneath the surface, I felt something bloom. He had taken my side, unprompted, not out of obligation, not for show. Out of instinct, that night I couldn't sleep. My husband lay beside me, snoring softly. I stared at the ceiling, every sound from the hallway registering like thunder. I could hear a door open, His footsteps. Water from the upstairs bathroom. Silence again. I reached for my phone without thinking. The message I typed was impulsive, reckless. I erased it, then typed again, slower this time. You were bold tonight. Seconds passed. Then his reply arrived. You were worth it. I stared at those 4 words, simple, direct, and completely, utterly destabilizing. It wasn't flirtation anymore. It wasn't teasing. This wasn't a game, not for him. And the part of me that still wanted to resist, the married woman, the loyal wife, the woman who made soufflés for family dinners, she wasn't loud enough to drown out the whisper I kept hearing in my head. He saw me. I turned my phone face down and closed my eyes. But I didn't sleep, not because of guilt, but because of everything that had been quiet for too long and was suddenly, violently awake. My husband left again that Thursday, this time for a 2-day retreat with his former classmates from university. Some kind of annual tradition he rarely skipped. He packed light, took his usual cologne, reminded me that the neighbors would be walking their dog past the house at 8 in the morning, as if that tiny piece of information mattered. He kissed my forehead without really looking and said, "Take some time for yourself." I nodded and smiled. That's what I always did. But the moment the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled differently. It wasn't relief, exactly. More like a loosening, something unspoken that uncoiled in my ribs. The kind of breath you take not when you're safe, but when you know no one is watching. By late morning, I had invented a reason to go into town. Groceries, wine for the weekend, a new set of towels for the guest bathroom. None of it was urgent, and I think he knew that when he offered to drive. But he didn't question me. He just grabbed the car keys and met me by the front door. The drive into the city was quiet, not awkwardly so. We had found a rhythm in silence. There was something about the low hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal that filled in what we didn't need to say. Outside, the sky was flat and gray, the kind of weather that blurred edges and softened details. I stared out the window for a while, then glanced sideways. His hand rested on the gear shift. Long fingers, clean nails. He tapped twice, absent-mindedly, and I felt that pulse again in my throat. It was always the smallest movements, casual, unmeant, that did the most damage. We parked near the old market square. I adjusted my coat, smoothed my hair without realizing it. We walked close but not touching, like people who didn't want to be seen together but didn't want to be apart. In a small wine shop, while I debated, between 2 bottles I didn't care about, he leaned in slightly and said, low enough that only I could hear, "You like the one with the red label. You always go back to it." I turned to him. There was no smirk, no challenge, just a memory. I hadn't realized he'd stored. "You notice everything, don't you?" "Just you," he said. I paid for the wine with shaking fingers. Later, over coffee at a tiny cafe tucked between boutiques, he offered to split a slice of cake. I declined, but he ordered it anyway and placed the fork in front of me. I tasted it without thinking. He watched me. Not in that hungry, devouring way men sometimes do, but with the quiet intensity of someone who studies brush strokes instead of the painting. When we returned to the car, I realized I'd left my scarf in the changing room of the home store we'd visited earlier. He offered to run back and get it. I stayed behind, windows cracked, radio low. While waiting, I opened my bag to check my phone and saw, tucked beneath the receipt from the cafe, a pair of lace panties I hadn't remembered packing, the same pair he'd jokingly picked out for me weeks ago in a store aisle, held up between 2 candles with a crooked grin. I had laughed and told him he was ridiculous, but apparently I'd bought them. And apparently I'd brought them today. I didn't remember choosing them that morning, but they were there, neatly folded, waiting. He returned with the scarf. I didn't speak, just smiled and nodded as he climbed into the driver's seat. My pulse thudded against my skin like a warning bell wrapped in silk. We drove home as the sky began to darken. At a red light, he reached over and turned down the volume of the music. His fingers brushed mine on the dial. I didn't pull away. Back at the house, I made tea. He went to his room. The weight of the day sat in my stomach. Not heavy, but insistent, like hunger you've ignored for too long. Around 10, I walked down the hall toward the guest bathroom. I told myself I was just checking on the towels I'd washed earlier, folded and placed on the linen shelf. That was the thought I clung to, even as my feet took me a different direction, even as I stopped outside his room, my knuckles hovering near the door. I knocked once, softly, barely a sound. The door opened almost immediately. He stood there, barefoot, t-shirt slightly wrinkled, hair tousled. He didn't speak, neither did I. I stepped inside, he closed the door behind me. The latch clicked, that was all. The click of the door behind me wasn't loud, but it echoed inside my body in a way that no sound ever had. It felt like a verdict, like the creak of an old wooden bridge when you take the first step and no, you can't turn back without changing something fundamental in yourself. He didn't speak, neither did I. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was overfull. Every moment from the past 2 weeks lived in that silence. Every glance, every almost touch, every breath held and then released too late. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the small desk lamp in the corner. I noticed. His shoes were neatly placed by the wall. A book, something philosophical, lay open on the nightstand, face down. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and laundry detergent. Clean, ordered, male. I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to. I wasn't pretending to hesitate. I was absorbing, grounding myself in that moment. My heart wasn't racing. It was slow, deliberate, too heavy for my chest. His gaze didn't waver. He waited. I liked that he didn't move first. I needed to be the one to break the line between thought and action. I stepped forward. 2 strides. He was in front of me. He raised a hand, tentative, as if asking for permission without words. His fingers brushed my wrist, not forcefully, just enough to feel the edge of my skin beneath the fabric of my sleeve. That contact sent a current through me that had nothing to do with nerves. It was deeper, denser. Like my body was remembering something it had never actually experienced. When he leaned in, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, reverent. Like he knew the weight of what we were about to do. I closed my eyes before our mouths met. I didn't want to see it. I wanted to feel it, completely, uninterrupted. His lips were warm and unhurried. There was no urgency, no collision, just heat, a slow unfolding, the kind of kiss that doesn't demand. It reveals. His hand came up to my neck, fingers grazing the hair at my nape. I exhaled into him, not from relief, from surrender. This kiss was different from the first. That one had been a question, soft and unsure. This one wasn't a question at all. It was a recognition, a vow spoken through skin. When we finally pulled apart, there was no rush to fill the space with words. He looked at me, not with hunger, not with regret, but with something more dangerous, certainty. And I knew in that moment that the line we had been walking was no longer beneath our feet. We'd stepped off of it, willingly, eyes open. Jam. Should go, I said. My voice was rough, not from shame, but from the tightness in my throat. He didn't stop me. He just nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped back. I left his room like someone walking out of a chapel, quiet, changed. The hallway was dark and still. My bare feet didn't make a sound on the hardwood floors. In the bathroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My cheeks were flushed, my lips swollen, my eyes different, not guilty, just awake. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed beside the empty space my husband usually filled and listened to the house breathe. Every creak of the pipes, every sigh of the walls felt loaded with knowledge. In the morning, I dressed carefully, but not excessively, soft fabric. Clean lines, underneath. I wore the same lace I'd worn the day before, not for him this time. For me, he was already downstairs reading something on his phone. He didn't look up when I entered the kitchen. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him. Neither of us spoke. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted me like a slap. I looked at the time. My husband wasn't due back until the evening, but it was him, getting out of a taxi, briefcase in hand. I watched him through the window, and for a moment, I saw him as a stranger would. Tall, composed, loyal. A man returning home, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in his absence. He came through the door, smiling, calling out my name in that familiar tone. I turned. Before I had a chance to let any emotion register, I met him in the hallway. He kissed me on the cheek, pulled me in for a brief embrace. I kept my body still, arms wrapped lightly around his back out of memory rather than feeling. He asked if everything was all right while he was gone. I nodded, said it had been quiet. Later that day, I found myself staring at the guest bathroom mirror again. My fingertips touched my lips as if they didn't belong to me anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sacred had been broken, not by mistake, not by force, but by choice. And the most terrifying part wasn't that I'd crossed a line, it was that I didn't want to step back. The days that followed moved in a strange kind of rhythm, measured, controlled, but with a quiet violence running beneath. Everything looked the same on the surface. Breakfasts were made, laundry folded, the dishwasher hummed its reliable song each night. My husband resumed his routines without pause, filling the house with his reassuring, predictable presence. He asked how I'd spent my time, and I told him the usual things: grocery shopping, laundry, a long walk, a bath. He believed every word. Or maybe he simply didn't want to look deeper. And yet, I noticed the change. He had brought me a gift, something small, wrapped in a brown paper bag with a ribbon tied too neatly, as if the presentation would compensate for the lack of meaning. Inside was a pale wool scarf, soft to the touch. "You're always cold," he'd said, smiling, as if this gesture were the embodiment of intimacy. I thanked him, even smiled. But when I pressed the scarf to my cheek later that evening, I felt nothing. No warmth, no connection, just fabric. That night, when we lay in bed, he reached for me. His touch was familiar, automatic, not rough or careless, but thoughtless, as though the gestures had been rehearsed too many times. I responded out of reflex, out of some mechanical, deeply wired sense of duty. But my body betrayed me. It didn't rise, didn't yield. It lay there, echoing the absence I hadn't yet named out loud. He kissed my shoulder and said goodnight. I turned to face the window, eyes wide open in the high, dark. Down the hall, the room where something had happened, where I had let something bloom and then run from it, was quiet. No footsteps, no flicker of light. Just the idea of him, like a heat source behind a wall. In the morning, he was gone. Before I woke, a work emergency, he'd left a note, the same handwriting I'd read for years. But now I lingered over the curves and slants, as if trying to find some hidden message. There was none, just logistics. When I walked into the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was that he was there, sitting at the table, barefoot, reading a book, not his phone, a book, something about the philosophy of intimacy. I paused in the doorway, taken aback by how different it felt to see him in the quiet, without urgency, without pretense. We didn't greet each other. He looked up and gave me the kind of nod that said more than a hello ever could. I moved past him, opened the cupboard, reached for a mug. My hand trembled slightly, and the ceramic clicked harder than I intended. Turned finally, leaning against the counter, and said quietly, "You've been distant." He didn't flinch, just closed his book gently and met my eyes. "You told me to stop. I said I wasn't ready. Same thing, isn't it?" There was no bitterness in his voice, only restraint. He spoke like someone measuring the weight of his words before letting them go. I shook my head. Not to me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the things we couldn't say out loud. I wondered if he had been waiting, for me, for a signal, for something impossible to name. "I'm not angry," I said. It came out too softly, too late. "I just don't know how to go back to pretending." "Neither do I," he replied. Then he stood, picked up his book, and walked past me, close enough for our arms to brush. My skin tingled for minutes after. The rest of the day passed like a dream I couldn't wake from. My husband returned home by dinner, tired but content. He asked about my day while chewing roasted chicken. I gave him answers that meant nothing. He nodded and moved on. The absence between us had become so normal that neither of us questioned it. I sat beside him on the couch that evening, the television flickering in front of us. He reached for my hand out of habit, not affection. I let him take it. Our fingers rested together like pieces of an old machine that used to work and now only mimicked the motion. At some point, I slipped away, claimed I needed a shower. I stood under the stream of hot water longer than necessary, trying to scrub away the thoughts that clung to my skin. When I stepped out, I wrapped the towel around myself and walked to the mirror. I studied my reflection, not for flaws, but for signs of life. The woman staring back at me had become a stranger. Her body looked the same. Her face held the same lines. But her eyes had changed. They didn't blink away doubt anymore. They dared to want. Later that night, after my husband had gone to bed, I stepped outside. The air was cool, and I wrapped his gifted scarf around my neck, more for irony than comfort. A glass of wine in hand, I walked barefoot to the edge of the porch. He was standing by the garage, smoking, something I hadn't seen him do in years. He didn't notice me at first. Or maybe he did and waited. When he turned, our eyes met again. Across the dark, across the distance, across the impossible. He didn't smile, but something about his face softened, a silent acknowledgment of all that had been stirred but not spoken. I raised the glass, a gesture that meant nothing, a gesture that meant everything. He nodded once, flicked the cigarette to the gravel, and disappeared into the house, and I stood there. The night wrapped around me like a promise, or a warning. I still hadn't decided which. There are moments in a marriage when you realize just how rehearsed everything has become. Not the big things, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. Those are easy. They come with scripts, but it's the small gestures, the unconscious choreography of daily life, that expose the cracks, the way two people move around each other in a kitchen. Fold sheets side by side, sit in silence without acknowledging its weight. We were still dancing the old steps, but the music had changed. Or maybe I was the one who stopped hearing it. That Sunday, my husband suggested a picnic by the lake. His nephew had come to visit for the weekend, and my mother-in-law had mentioned wanting a bit of fresh air, as if the neighborhood wasn't filled with parks and patios. I packed the basket as always. Sandwiches cut diagonally, the good cheese, linen napkins. The performance of domestic harmony was polished to perfection. He was quiet that morning, the younger one. We hadn't spoken since the night I stood on the porch and raised my glass toward him like a white flag or a dare. I still don't know which. I hadn't knocked on his door. He hadn't appeared in mine. But the weight of that distance made the air between us feel too warm, even in early spring. We arrived at the lake mid-morning. There were children feeding ducks, couples strolling hand in hand. It was the kind of place people take photos to remember their lives looking better than they are. We found a quiet patch beneath a large tree, close to the water, and laid out. The blanket. My husband opened a bottle of wine with too much enthusiasm, as if willing joy into the moment. While everyone settled, he asked me to help bring the thermos from the car. I agreed, knowing it would leave me walking back alone with him. The moment we were out of sight, the silence between us returned, taut and electric. I walked ahead, refusing to look at him, though I could feel him watching me. Halfway back on the shaded path between the parking lot and the trees, he reached out and gently touched my elbow. Not possessive, not insistent, just a moment of contact. My body reacted before I could think, heat blooming across my chest. Down my arms, I turned to face him. "Don't," I said. But it wasn't a warning, it was a plea. He didn't move closer. He didn't speak. But his eyes held everything I was afraid to name. Desire, confusion, restraint, and something much more dangerous. Understanding. I haven't forgotten, he said quietly. Any of it. You think I have? He shook his head. But you pretend better. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth lived too close to the surface, and if I opened my mouth again, I was afraid it would come pouring out. When we returned to the group, my husband's nephew, 16, bright-eyed, too curious for his own good, was flipping through pictures on his phone. He was showing his grandmother a set of photos he'd taken just minutes before. "Look at this one," he said. "Kind of a cool angle." I glanced over his shoulder. It was a photo of us, me and him, walking on the path, caught in motion, unaware. We weren't touching, but we were too close. His head was turned toward me, the edge of his jaw tense, focused. My shoulders leaned ever so slightly in his direction. We didn't look like family. We looked like something else, something harder to explain. My husband laughed. Looks like you two were conspiring. I froze. He was joking. Of course he was. But for the first time in weeks, I felt the ground shift beneath me. It wasn't the photo. It was the possibility of being seen. Not just felt, not just guessed. Seen. That night, after the house was quiet, I sat alone in the bedroom, scrolling absently through my phone. I kept going back to that photo, zooming in, then out. My husband had already forgotten it, but I couldn't. There was a line and we were standing on it, and I didn't know if I wanted to step away or fall. The photo stayed with me, not physically. I didn't save it, didn't ask for it, didn't dare mention it, but it lived behind my eyes, like a half-remembered dream that keeps resurfacing at odd moments. The angle, the distance, the unmistakable tension between our bodies. If I had seen that image without context, I would have known immediately. Something was happening between those two people. Something that had already begun, even if no one had touched anything yet. After that day at the lake, something shifted, not between him and me. There. The air remained unchanged, silent, dense, and alive. But my husband began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. He stopped reaching for my hand when we watched TV. He no longer asked if I needed anything from the store. At first, I told myself he was simply distracted, work, family, fatigue, but then came the questions that weren't quite questions. How was the picnic for you? Everything feel normal? Or over coffee? You seemed quiet yesterday. Was something on your mind? They were offered gently, as if he wasn't looking for answers so much as testing how I would react. I played my part with care, responding warmly but vaguely, never directly. But the edge was there now, unspoken, sharp, lingering between us. Like the taste of metal in the mouth, I started noticing his pauses. He'd look at me just a beat longer. His silences weren't passive anymore. They were watchful, a kind of stillness that made me feel both exposed and invisible. And at night, when he lay beside me in bed, I could sense the distance widening, even as our bodies remained close. The younger one kept to himself during those days. He avoided the kitchen in the morning, left the house more often. When I passed his room, the door was closed, sometimes locked, but every so often our eyes would meet, accidentally, inevitably, and the room around us would vanish. Those moments felt dangerous not because of what we did, but because of how natural it had become to want more. One evening, I was putting away laundry in our bedroom when I found a pair of earrings. Delicate studs, silver, the ones my husband had given me after his last trip. I had worn them the day I first kissed someone else. The irony wasn't lost on me. I held them in my palm and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the way they caught the light. Once, they had meant something. Now they felt like artifacts from a version of myself I no longer recognized. I slipped them into the back of the drawer without a word. Later that night, I walked into the kitchen and found my husband already there, standing by the window, holding a glass of water. The light above the sink flickered slightly. He didn't look at me. I keep wondering, he said quietly, when you started pulling away. Whether it was something I said or something I didn't. I froze. He wasn't accusing. He wasn't even asking. He was stating a truth he didn't need me. To confirm, I reached for a cup from the cabinet, trying to mask the trembling in my hand. You haven't done anything wrong, I said. That doesn't mean I haven't missed something. I turned toward him then. His expression was calm, but his eyes were tired. There was a hollowness there I hadn't seen before. The kind that comes from knowing, deep down, that something has already changed, and all that's left is to name it. We're just in a strange phase, I offered. He nodded, but not in agreement. It was the kind of nod that meant, I hear you, but I don't believe you. After he went to bed, I stayed up, pacing the living room. My phone buzzed once, an unknown number. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. In the morning, he was gone again. Early meeting, another excuse. I made the bed slowly. Folding the blanket with more care than necessary, I opened the window. The air outside felt sharper. I walked down the hallway and paused outside his door. It was slightly ajar. He was packing, no suitcases, just a backpack and a folded jacket. On the chair, he turned when he noticed me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Going somewhere? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Just zipped the bag and stood upright. Maybe it's time. Time for what? Time to leave? Time to protect what little we hadn't yet ruined? I didn't stop him. I didn't even pretend to try. He walked. Past me, shoulders squared, but his eyes lingered on mine a second too long. In that look, I saw something final. Not anger, not regret, just a quiet surrender. As the front door closed behind him, the house exhaled. A soundless release of tension that filled the space like fog. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at my hands. For the first time in years, they looked unfamiliar. It wasn't that I had lost something. It was that I had become someone I could no longer predict, and I wasn't sure I wanted to return. He didn't come back the next morning. Not for breakfast, not for lunch, not even for the quiet dinner I still prepared, not knowing why. The table was set out of habit. 2 plates, 2 glasses, folded napkins, but only one chair was filled. I sat in silence. Feeling the stillness press in from all sides, the house didn't breathe. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt subdued. Like it, too, had fallen into hush. My husband was away on a business trip. He'd left a short message, delayed by a day. Dinner with investors, don't wait up. I read it 3 times. There was nothing in the words themselves, but something in the way he wrote them felt final, stripped, as if he sensed more than he was willing to admit. Maybe he knew, maybe he was choosing not to know, or maybe he had just stopped asking questions. He didn't want answers to. I wandered through the house barefoot, not because I was tired, but because the sound of my own steps irritated me. I didn't want to hear myself existing. I didn't want to acknowledge that he was gone, not just from the room, but from my present, and I from his. That night, I picked up my phone and called. Him. He didn't answer. Not the first time, not after 10 minutes. I didn't try again. Instead, I opened the bedroom window and let the cold air in. I stood there in a t-shirt, arms bare, no wine, no book, no distraction, just the quiet, the raw, biting silence of choices made. An hour later, I heard the front door open. Slowly, the kind of careful, hesitant sound that belongs to someone unsure if they should be there. I didn't move, I listened. He didn't come upstairs. I heard the fridge open, the light switch click, then nothing. No footsteps, no drawers, just silence. I waited. When it became unbearable, I left the room. He was sitting at the kitchen table. No food, no drink, just his hands folded in front of him. He faced away from me. I stepped into the room, soft enough not to startle him. He turned slowly. His eyes met mine. Calm, unreadable. The hunger, the tension that had once burned between us, it was gone. What was left was heavier, resignation. You're not here to say goodbye, are you? I asked. My voice was quiet, controlled. He shook his head. I didn't want it to end like this, he said. How did you want it to end? He looked down. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. I recognized that gesture. He always did it when he wasn't sure if he could say the truth aloud. I thought maybe if I left, it would fade, that it would just dissolve if I didn't feed it. You were wrong. He nodded once. Slowly, then silence again. I waited. I said, for you to reach out. You didn't look for me, and you didn't call. That's when he looked at me, really looked at me, not with the fire from before, but with something quieter, a kind of sorrow that sits in the chest like weight, a knowing. I thought if I came back, he said, you'd say it, that you'd ask. Me to stay, I swallowed, and if I did? He didn't answer right away. Then almost painfully. I would have stayed. My breath caught, but I didn't let it show. I stood straighter, arms still crossed, body still wrapped in self-control. I didn't feel anymore. He stood, slowly, picked up his backpack from beside the chair. No one's to blame, he said, but we both know. This won't stop. He walked past me, and for the first time since all of this began, he didn't brush against me. No subtle contact. No hidden message in movement, just absence. The door opened and closed. No slam, no drama. I didn't follow. I went back to the kitchen, sat where he'd been sitting just minutes earlier. The chair still held the shape of him, faintly. I reached for the table's edge and let my fingers rest there, where his had gripped. I wasn't crying. I was remembering, and I knew this wasn't the end, not of the story, not of the ache, not of the longing. Some endings don't shatter, they fade, quietly, but they never really let you go.